Before I begin tonight's class, looks like we have a nice crowd. Thank you everybody for joining us. I'm grateful when people join us. It's wonderful. I don't mind when people watch it, the recording, but when it's live, it's even better. So thank you for joining us tonight. Very, very happy to see everybody, or at least their pictures. Okay. Tonight's class is about spirituality. I think we'll have a series about spirituality beginning tonight. I want to point out that next Sunday night I will not be teaching, and that is simply because it's my sister's 20th yahrzeit, and we will, Emir Hashem, be broadcasting that event via Zoom. I don't know exactly what time it's going to be yet, but you're welcome to tune into that if all the technical stuff works out. So that's going to be in Lakewood, New Jersey. I will not be here in California, and I will not be teaching my regular class this coming Sunday night. Okay, so let's begin. I've got an interesting class prepared. I think it's interesting. I definitely I'm enjoying working through this one. And I'll start off with something that my mother shared with me. Even though she's on, really, she can share it herself. Nevertheless, I'll start off with something that she shared with me today, actually. She told me that recently William Shatner, who I myself don't know if I ever watched anything in which he played, but apparently he was in Star Trek and a famous space traveler. Of course, it was all in a studio and a green screen, and he never entered space until recently. And in his recent foray, if you will, into space, or at least the edge of space, upon landing, I'm going to quote something that I found online, he had some teary words to share with Bezos and all those that turned out at the landing site to greet him. Just everybody in the world needs to see there is Mother Earth and comfort. But what you can see is black. What you have given me is the most profound experience I can imagine. I'm so filled with emotion with what just happened. It's extraordinary, extraordinary. Now, that is what I saw online. The version that my mother shared with me was a little bit different, in which he was literally shaking. He's not a young man anymore. He's literally shaking and lost, really like lost for words and super emotional. But he had no direction for his experience. He had no outlet for his experience. Thank you, Myrna. Yeah, maybe he's 90. He had no way. He had no words to describe his experience. Now, I don't know what kind of life he lives. I don't know what religion he practices. But the bottom line is he was not prepared for spirituality, for a spiritual experience, and so he could not articulate what it was that he shared. That was a perspective of his perspective. Take it or leave it, it's up to you. That being said, there are people who in life have experiences that are extraordinary and special, perhaps spiritual. And they don't know what to do. They don't know what to do. Oh, Harriet, I'm so happy you're on. I think you're gonna like this next story. My mom told me she had a patient who was in a coma. And while she was in a coma, she had a dream. And in the dream, she met up with her family members, and I believe it was her mother, who was sitting there at a table, and her mom said to her, no, you don't belong here yet. It's not your time yet. Go back. Okay? We all know what that is. It's a near-death experience, NDE. And we all know that, we believe there is an afterlife, and the souls live on. People's souls live on, and people have these experiences in which they communicate with relatives who've passed on. But here's a woman, her reaction to the story was, well, I don't really know what I'm supposed to do with that story. Again, she didn't have the vocabulary. She didn't understand that spirituality, that life is not, what you see is not what you get, but that life is real, and spirituality is real, and God is real. The world to come, the soul is real. And that's a second story, if you will, just kind of as an opening. And that is, I think, kind of sad. Not kind of sad, extremely sad. You take a look at our Parsha, and we'll talk about our Parsha, our Parshiot, Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and their experiences with the divine. It's not a coincidence that we're talking about spirituality now. They're the first ones to experience, and if you will, this sort of experience, and they decided to share that with their children and their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren. The word spirituality is difficult to define. If you were to look it up in the dictionary, you would see related to the spirit. And if you look up the word spirit, you'll see related to spirituality. Okay? Now, when people think of and try to define spirituality, their references may be from a Christian or a Far Eastern perspective rather than a Jewish one. In Christianity or in Buddhism, for example, a holy person is an individual who strives to separate himself from the world, living a hermit-like existence in complete abstinence from all things worldly. In contrast, Jewish spirituality is achieved primarily through our involvement in the physical world and through our dealings with people, which imbues our experiences and interactions with meaning. It's about meaning, it's about purpose, it is about the way that we live our life, but it's the way we live our life in this world and with other people. I'll tell you something amazing. This past Shabbos, we had a special guest, Myrna's granddaughter, Chaiki, had a special guest for Shabbos lunch, and she brought her Dvar Torah with her. And the Dvar Torah that she brought with her made reference to a concept that Chabad espouses, I guess probably Hasidus in general, I'm not expert, called Dira B'Tachtonim. Dira B'Tachtonim, which means in I guess Kabbalistic literature, it's a dwelling for God in this world. Okay? A dwelling for God in this world. It's not that God is above this world. God is part of this world. We'll talk a little bit what that means. We don't subscribe to pantheism. We don't subscribe to the notion that God is everything and everything is God. That's not Judaism. Not everything is inherently holy. But there are instances of intrinsic spirituality, such as Shabbat, such as Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel. And there is potential for spirituality through our thought, through our speech, and through our actions. We're going to talk about Rabbi Stewart. We're going to talk about Rabbi Twersky soon. Okay, we'll talk about Rabbi Twersky soon. Jewish spirituality is the development and the strengthening of an eternal relationship with God. To me, what's really amazing about Chaiki's Dvar Torah is that here she is. How old is she? 10? 9 or 10? Something like that? And already she's being introduced to this concept. I asked her, do you know what it means? She's like, no. I said, do you want to know what it means? She's like, no. Okay, so she's a 9-year-old. But the school's already introducing conceptually that if you want to have a relationship, you want spirituality, it's about a relationship with God. It's about bringing God into your world, into your life. Jewish spirituality is this development and the strengthening of an eternal relationship with God. Because God is the source of meaning, of values, of truth, of goodness in our universe. God created, He sustains, He guides the universe to its destiny. And of course, God established a framework for mankind to actualize our potential by using free will, another one of Harriet's favorite topics, through Torah study and mitzvah observance. And the framework of Torah and mitzvahs is, of course, comprehensive, because Judaism sees the opportunity for spiritual growth in everything that we do to fulfill our collective and personal missions in life. There's a beautiful idea that I read years ago about the order of the Parshiot. Getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. A couple months from now, we're going to read Parshat Yitro. Parshat Yitro is, of course, the story of Yitro joining the Jewish people after they left Egypt. And in the process of them leaving Egypt and being in the desert, what happens? What happens to the Jewish people? They get the Torah. The greatest event to ever happen in the entire history of humanity. They get the Torah. And then what happens right after you get the Torah? What's the next parsha? Parshat Mishpatim. What is Parshat Mishpatim? Parshat Mishpatim is laws, social laws, interpersonal mitzvot that you might have come up with on your own, perhaps yeah, perhaps no. And it seems like such a mundane kind of a anticlimactic, if you will, some sort of so mundane to follow up the greatest, most climactic event in the entirety of Jewish history, or human history, the giving of the Torah. God reveals himself at Sinai. And what do we get? Next, Mishpatim. So I saw a beautiful pshat, I think, from Rav Kook. He explains because when it comes to Judaism, when it comes to spirituality, when it comes to relationship with God, you go from the boardroom to the bedroom. There's opportunity for spiritual growth in everything that we do to fulfill our collective and personal missions in life. There's spiritual potential in all of us all the time. The class that we're going to focus on tonight, it's a class that maybe many classes, but the first part of our conversation about spirituality is a definition and a framework for Jewish spirituality. Later on, we'll talk about pathways for spiritual development. We'll talk about expression and connection in humanity, time, space, within structures, for example, spirituality in the synagogue, through certain objects, Torah scrolls, mezuzahs. And we'll talk about spiritual potential, as we've been saying, throughout our lives. But for tonight, we're really going to focus on a definition and a framework for Jewish spirituality. There are obviously many, many, many books, thousands of books maybe, that have been written about this topic, but we are going to focus, we'll do what we can. So for tonight, or at least for this first class, we're going to talk about how did the first Jew discover God? What can we learn from his journey? What's the Jewish definition of spirituality? What are the means to actualize a person's spirituality? And is Jewish spirituality only for sages and rabbis, or is it something that is universal? So how does one approach finding or enhancing one's spirituality? If you were to Google this, or go to Amazon or your local bookstore, there's a limitless amount of advice for seekers of spirituality. There's an abundance of opportunity to begin a spiritual search. New Wave spirituality, traditional organized religions, Far Eastern philosophy, meditations and retreats. I want to share an incident with you that sheds light on how a Jewish person can relate to the search for spirituality. I'm going to do this by way of sharing my screen with you. And you might be familiar with this story. Take a look. Okay. So, who was that playing? Anybody know? Amazing playing. Itana, thank you. Do you know who that was?
It was
One of the
very
most
famous. It was a
jo-
very famous
very famous violinist named Joshua
violinist.
Bell.
Mhm.
Who's Joshua Bell? So here's the story. Um, everyone knows who Joshua Bell is, okay? In 2007, put a baseball cap on his head. He went to the metro station in Washington, and he started to play. Okay. Top-notch conductor, fellow famous person Leonard Slatkin predicted that out of 1,000 people, my guess is there might be 35 or 40 who will recognize the quality for what it is. Maybe 75 to 100 will stop and spend some time listening. He predicted he would make $150. And he was right. Out of 1,097 people that passed him by, 27 gave any money, 7 stopped and listened for any length of time. How much did he make? He makes thousands of dollars for every concert performance on the greatest concert stages of the world. $52.17. And that $20 was from one person who actually recognized him. Okay? In 2014, he returned to the subway, but this time his appearance was announced. And of course, he had thousands of people listening to him. Famous incident, okay? That was written up in the Wall Street Journal. Now, this was a social experiment. There's actually a beautiful story about his violin. I'm not gonna. I don't know if now's not the time to get into it. But Joshua Bell's violin was originally owned by somebody who I believe was killed by the Nazis, by a Jew. I believe it was by a Jew who eventually was killed by the Nazis. There's all kinds of interesting things about his violin. He actually took a cab 2 blocks so he wouldn't have to walk with his $3 million Stradivarius violin with him. Okay, apparently it was crafted in 1713. Bell purchased it for $3.5 million. Okay. So the person who's writing this writes like this. Like the vast majority of readers, I find myself contemplating how I would have reacted had I been at the L'Enfant Plaza station in DC that Friday morning. Surely, I thought, I would have noticed the brilliant music even if I was rushing past on my way to work. How could I not have been one of the select few who grasped that this music was different? It's on an article on H.com by someone by the name of Basi Gruen. So how would you have reacted? How would I have reacted? Okay, somebody maybe like myself, I don't know if I'm that musical, someone like David Horvath probably would have noticed. Are there things that we don't notice because life is moving so fast? In Judaism, the search for spirituality starts by developing an appreciation for the obvious things a person can observe in his or her world. The first Jew, Avraham, started his journey towards God by making these observations and then asking a very simple question of whose world is it? We talked about this on Shabbos at length, but let's review because not everyone who's here tonight was at Shul. We know the Medrash tells us that Avraham looked at the world and he realized that the order he sees is a sign of intelligent planning. Rabbi Yitzchak said that there was a person who was traveling from place to place and he saw a palace that was doleket, and we'll use the translation illuminated. It was lit up, and he wondered, is it conceivable that this palace doesn't have a caretaker? And thereupon the ruler of the palace appeared to him and said, I am the ruler of this palace and its caretaker. And similarly, Avraham Avinu also wondered, is it conceivable that this world is without a caretaker? So God appeared to him and says, I'm the master of the universe and its caretaker. How is it, we talked about this a little bit Shabbos morning, but how is it that Avraham was able to perceive what anybody else could have noticed had they been paying a bit more attention? And the answer, of course, is that Avraham was objective in his search for spirituality, and he was prepared to accept the conclusions of his exploration. On Shabbos, we touched on motivation. The person has to be motivated to see a problem. Because Avram was a searcher, he was a seeker. But it's not just that he was a seeker, but he was prepared to accept the conclusions of his exploration. And I think that's a critical point. Second, Avram recognized that God's very creation of humanity, that he gives us life, and that God empowers us with the faculties and resources to live independently with free will. That is the greatest possible kindness, the greatest possible chesed. Our host is God, and we're all guests in his home, every second of our existence. Once Avram realized that there's a God who created the world, and that he allows us to exist and to make those choices, pardon me for a second. Texted somebody earlier, they were having class now, and she texted. I guess she was confused by that, so just clarify. Okay? Avram Avinu realizing that there's a creator, and yet people are choosing to live their life oblivious of God the creator. Well, clearly, he allows us to live independently with free will. And that's really a tremendous chesed, a tremendous kindness. We're not robots, but yet at the same time, we are guests in his home. Number 3, Avram's discovery of God led him to a revolutionary conclusion. That God set up the world in such a way that we're actually his partners in creation. To use a buzzword, and not in the way that you'll usually hear it, tikkun olam, which means to complete the world by emulating his attributes. And the paramount way for us to accomplish that is for us to practice chesed. This is how some people understand the impact and the import of Avram's discovery of God. In other words, Abraham saw God as a Bal Chesed, as an extraordinary doer of kindness, and he realized that he wants us to act with chesed, which is really incredible and also makes a lot of sense, because what is it that is Abraham's character trait that he is focused on and develops more than anybody else in history? It is the character of chesed. Rabbi Berkowitz, the Rosh Hashiva of Eshet Torah, says in a class called How Torah Nourishes the Soul, he says, everyone saw the palace and benefited from its light. They looked at this world and they harnessed its power for the betterment of their own quality of life. The novelty in Avram's approach was that he did not look at the world as a tool for the fulfillment of his own wants and desires. He recognized that the world has an owner, and he wanted to know, what does the owner want? He wasn't in it for himself. He wanted to do God's will no matter what the cost. And so spirituality begins with the selfless motivation of benefiting the other, even at one's own expense. In every other religion, the founder of that religion is credited with some kind of supernatural grasp of the truth. But in Judaism, the forefather associated with truth is not Avraham, but it's Yaakov, it's Jacob. Avram's grandson. Avram himself is associated with the trait of chesed, loving kindness. It says in Micah or Micha, Titin emes liYaakov chesed la'Avraham, grant truth to Yaakov, chesed to Avram. One might have expected the founder of the religion to be the one associated with truth. After all, it's Avraham who is credited with arriving at the truth of God's existence, all on his own. But Judaism does not begin with the truth. It begins with a truth. That if one wants to find God, then he has to be committed to following in his ways, come what may, committed to benefiting others, and committed to God's vision instead of one's own. I want to I want to share something with you that's very, very powerful, and some of you have heard it from me before. It's very, very, very powerful and very, very important. I believe I originally heard this from Rabbi Lopiansky, and it's going to sound a little bit harsh, perhaps, but the extreme way of saying it will hopefully bring across a point. There's two kinds of people in the world. There are people who inhabit God's world, and there are people for whom God is a part of their world. Say it one more time. Two kinds of people in this world. People who inhabit God's world, and people for whom God is part of their world. And what's the difference between the two? So imagine, let me see if I can do this in a clever sort of way here. This is not what I wanted to show. Hold on one second. Stop share. Hold on one second, please. Let's see if this works here. There we go. Draw, circle. Okay. So let me do it like this. Okay, we've got two people here. We'll make them different colors. Here we go. Two kinds of people, okay? Well, actually, two worlds, okay? Here we have two worlds. The first world is God's world. Okay? Second world is my world. Me. Okay. Now, in my world, let's do it like this. We've got a pie. Okay? We've got a whole pie here. Let's keep it simple, shall we? Here we have my work, my family, God, lowercase g, kind of on purpose. And then here we have, I don't know, hobbies. All right, we'll keep it simple. God's world, God is just a part of my world. When you're part of God's world, so then there's me. Okay? And everything that's related to me, it's all part of God's world. You see the difference between the two? You see, when God says something, what's he saying? He says, do this, do that, whatever it might be. Okay, I'm part of his world. I'm going to try to bring meaning to his world. Tikkun olam is God's world. I'm bringing meaning to God's world, not my world, not the world that I think is the world that should exist, but it's part of God's world. And that includes, of course, Torah, mitzvos, and everything else. Character development, etc. In this world, well, let's see. Do I have time for what God wants? What if my work interferes? What if my hobbies interfere? What if my family interferes? Then God is going to take a backstage. Everyone with me? Let me give another difference, okay? Another difference. Major difference. When something bad happens, okay? Let's write the word bad. Bad stuff, all right? Bad stuff happens. Yeah, I'm part of God's world. That's what God wants. It stinks. I hate it. I don't like it. I don't have to love it. But it is what it is. And I'll try to deal with it. That's emunah. That's faith. But if that's when I'm part of God's world, because I understand everything that happens to me is because it's part of God's world. But if God is just part of my world, well then I'm the one in control here, not God. And it doesn't make any sense. So I can't turn to God because it just doesn't work for me. You with me? So the bad stuff is not part of God. The bad stuff is something I can't wrap my mind around. Obviously, there's a continuum between the two, and we're not one or the other. Sometimes we're here, sometimes we're there, okay? Sometimes we're over here, like in Kippur time. Sometimes we're over here, sometimes we're in the middle. It all depends, okay? Am I making sense? Okay. Give myself a little copy of this for some other use. Okay. That is, to me, like, I didn't hear that entire thing from Rabbi Lipyansky, but that's how I understand the point that he was making. You're part of God's world, or God is part of your world. It's a tremendous difference between the two. This a point that we're making right now about Avram Avinu, that it's not about a truth. It's about, looking at that world and making that determination to accept the conclusion of my exploration. That's different. Other people weren't holding there. And this brings us to our next point, which is that seeing the world as God's world requires stepping out of our egocentric perspective. Abraham's first and primary chesed was that he discovered God while surrounded with idols and falsehood. And of course, he began to proclaim his existence to the world. And to do so, he had to escape from any sort of preconceived notion, from the way he was nurtured, from the comfort of familiarity, and he had to see things as they really were, without the filters of ego and self. To discover the artist, if you will, one has to remove oneself from the picture and seek truth. And irrespective of the consequences as a result of discovering it. And that process requires chesed. That's a different concept of chesed. Chesed doesn't just mean, of course, it includes being kind to people, smiling at people, supporting people, helping the poor. Of course, chesed is all that. This is a different kind of chesed. This is a chesed of getting out of oneself, of developing some sort of objectivity. And so the starting point then, and of course it's a chesed to God in a way, because you're recognizing him. The starting point then in our quest for exploring Jewish spirituality is the willingness to go beyond one's personal self-centered needs, as demonstrated by chesed, and by being objective, willing to accept the consequences of one's search. And of course this process takes serious effort. So I know that somebody before, I think it was my mother, said something about Rabbi Twersky. Rabbi Twersky in the opening of his book has a long talk about what makes a human being as opposed to animals. It's true. And Rabbi Twersky has a whole book called, I think it's called On Spirituality. It's a whole book, I think it's called On Spirituality. But listen to this quote here from Rabbi Twersky. In the search for purpose, we must be brutally honest and frank. If we are searching for truth, we must be prepared to accept the consequences of truth. The fundamental difficulty in the search for purpose is that we do find an ultimate purpose. If we do find an ultimate purpose, we feel ourselves committed to fulfill it, and that is indeed a responsibility. It is much more convenient to avoid the entire concept. This is the crux of the issue of spirituality. Spirituality and comfort are often at opposite poles. If the way to spirituality were comfortable, most of humankind might have chosen it. It is, however, a long and challenging path, often requiring a basic reorientation of one's character with patience, perseverance, and preparedness for whatever comes. Says Rabbi Twersky, when I travel through the countryside, I often begin to reflect on the various aspects of spirituality. And it has occurred to me how much calmer and more tranquil life would be if we were free of such turbulence-causing thoughts. Then I pass by a field where cows are out to pasture, and I see how tranquil they are, lying in the warm sun, chewing their cud. At this point, I take pride in being a human being and conclude that I'm willing to pay the price of turbulence rather than have bovine tranquility. Okay, so this is all in the context of Avram Avinu and the Medrash teaching us that he saw a world that was illuminated, that was lit up. There is, of course, an alternate explanation to the Medrash, which is he did not see a world that was dolekes, lit up, illuminated, but rather he saw a world aflame, a palace lit up in flames. Rabbi Reuven Leichter says that the Medrash is teaching us that the world is a struggle between evil and good, or good and evil, and that we as mankind, we as humanity, are responsible for both. Most commentators translate the Medrash as a palace ablaze, and then the whole recognition of Avram assumes another depth. He saw that the world is a struggle between good and evil, and he asked, how can it be that no one extinguishes the fire? How could it be that no one is here to fight evil? And to this question he says, I am the one responsible for both good and evil. That is, I have free choice, and I'm going to make that choice. And I'm going to actualize the good and subdue the evil, that is, extinguish the flames. And finally, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, in his book, Radical Then, Radical Now, writes as follows. Avram sees a palace. The world has order, and therefore it has a creator. But the palace is in flames. The world is full of disorder, of evil, violence, and injustice. If God created the world, then he created man. Why does he allow man to destroy the world? How are we to resolve the order of nature with the disorder of society? Can God have made the world only to abandon it? From time immemorial to the present, there have always been two ways of seeing the world. The first says, there is no God. There are contending forces, chance and necessity, the chance that produces variation and a necessity that gives a strong victory over the weak. There is no palace, there are only flames. The second view insists, there is a God, and everything exists because he made it. And all that happens, transpires, because he willed it. And therefore all injustice is an illusion. There is a palace, and therefore there are no flames. The faith of Avram begins in the refusal to accept either answer, for both contain a truth, and between them there is a contradiction. The first accepts the reality of evil, the second the reality of God. The first says that if evil exists, God does not exist. The second says that if God exists, evil does not exist. But supposing both exist, supposing there are both the palace and the flames, Judaism begins not in wonder that the world is, but in protest that the world is not as it ought to be. It is in that cry, that sacred discontent, that Avram's journey begins. At the heart of reality is a contradiction between order and chaos, the order of creation and the chaos we create. There is no resolution to this conflict at the level of thought. It can be resolved only at the level of action, only by making the world other than what it is. When things are as they ought to be, then we have reached our destination. But that is not now. It was not now for Avram, nor is it yet for us. Now, of course, this does not mean that Avram's vision of God is dualistic. Of course, he understands that God is in control of both good and evil. And initially, he was confused as to why God permits evil to happen. And his conclusion ultimately is that God wants us to reveal his goodness by ridding the world of evil. That's the deeper level of our spiritual journey, to recognize that God created the world with the possibility of evil in order to ultimately reveal his unity by the triumph of good over evil. This idea, of course, comes from Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, the knowing heart, Das Tifunos. So in our search for spirituality, we recognize, number one, we live in a world that reflects the chesed of God, which calls for our being objective and accepting the consequences of our search. Number two, the pursuit of genuine spirituality requires hard work and often requires a basic reorientation of our character. And number three, it is mankind's actions that lead to a world characterized by either good or evil, where we need to take responsibility for our actions. And that's an expression of our spirituality. And in this context, we're going to further proceed to explore, again, the Jewish definition of spirituality. We're not going to do that tonight. It's just about 8 o'clock and almost time for my chavrusa. But this is the beginning, if you will, of a conversation about spirituality. And I'm grateful to everybody who joined us tonight. Thank you so much for coming and for listening. Your feedback is always welcome. Hopefully I gave you some food for thought and a perspective of spirituality, one that's very, very different, hopefully, than you've ever heard before. I shouldn't say that. Hopefully this is all old news to you. and you understand exactly what it is that we're talking about. If anybody would like the notes, I'm happy to share. I wish you all a wonderful Shavua Tov. My pleasure. Have a good night, everybody.
Me too.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.